On the evening of January 24, 2023, a father left his home in Duxbury, Massachusetts, to run a few errands. His 3 children were inside. Cora was 5 years old. Dawson was 3. And Callan, the youngest, was only 8 months old. Their mother, Lindsay Clancy, was also home. Nothing about the evening initially suggested that the next few hours would become one of the most devastating criminal cases in Massachusetts. Then, at approximately 6:11 p.m., emergency dispatch received a call. A woman had reportedly jumped from a second-story window. When first responders arrived at the house on Summer Street, they found Lindsay outside, seriously injured. But inside the home was something far worse. 3 children were found unconscious in the basement. Cora and Dawson could not be saved. Callan was transported by helicopter to Boston Children's Hospital. He survived for several days before he too died. The medical examiner later determined that Cora and Dawson died from asphyxia, while Callan died from complications of asphyxia. And almost immediately, investigators faced a question that would define this case for years. What happened inside that house before Lindsay Clancy went through the window? The prosecution would eventually argue that the answer was deliberate murder. The defense would not seriously contest that Clancy killed the children. Instead, it would argue something far more complicated. That she was suffering from severe mental illness, including postpartum psychosis, and was not legally responsible for what she did. 3 children were dead. Their mother had survived. And the question that would eventually go before a jury was not simply who killed them. It was, what was happening inside the mind of the person who did? Before Lindsay Clancy became a defendant, before courtroom arguments, psychiatric evaluations and forensic evidence, there were 3 children. Cora Clancy was 5. Her father, Patrick Clancy, later described her in court as a child who loved princesses and had many friends. He remembered her as someone who liked taking care of other people. Dawson was 3. His world was filled with the interests of a toddler. Trucks, Paw Patrol, and the ordinary fascination with everything around him. And then there was Callan, 8 months old. Patrick described him simply as a happy baby. Those details matter because the trial would eventually become intensely focused on Lindsay Clancy's mental state. But the people at the center of the case were not legal arguments. They were 3 children. 3 lives that had existed outside the courtroom. 3 children whose father would eventually have to sit in a witness box and describe them to a jury. And yet, before that terrible night, the family story had looked very different. Lindsay Clancy was a labor and delivery nurse who had worked at Massachusetts General Hospital. Friends and people who knew the family described her as devoted to her children. But behind that image, according to testimony and court filings, something had been changing. The story did not begin on January 24. In many ways, prosecutors and defense attorneys agree on that. The disagreement is over what the months before the killings actually mean. After the birth of Callan, Lindsay Clancy's mental health deteriorated. According to accounts presented by the defense and testimony from Patrick, she experienced anxiety, insomnia, depression and thoughts that alarmed the people around her. Patrick testified that approximately a month before the killings, Lindsay had expressed thoughts about harming herself or the children. He said he found the situation confusing because he never saw her physically harm them. She could express disturbing thoughts and then, moments later, make lunch for the children, play with them or put them to bed. That contradiction became one of the most important features of the case. Could someone be severely mentally ill and still appear functional? Could a person experiencing dangerous thoughts continue performing ordinary parental tasks? And, most importantly, what does outward normality tell us about what was happening internally? The defense would say almost nothing. The prosecution would argue that her ability to plan, communicate and make decisions showed something very different. There was another important piece of evidence. Clancy sought professional treatment. According to her defense, she received psychiatric care, including both inpatient and outpatient treatment, and was prescribed numerous psychiatric medications during the months before the killings. Her attorneys would argue that she was overmedicated and that the treatment failed to control the rapidly deteriorating mental state. Prosecutors have presented a different interpretation. They argue that Clancy made deliberate choices during this period and that the evidence shows she was capable of planning and understanding what she was doing. And then came one of the most consequential pieces of evidence investigators uncovered. A search warrant affidavit later made public stated that investigators believed Clancy had used her phone to document her mental state. track medications and research ways to kill. But there is an important qualification. The public court documents did not specify exactly what searches were conducted, when they occurred, or how investigators learned about that alleged research. That distinction matters. The allegation became part of the prosecution's theory. But the publicly available warrant materials did not provide the complete search history itself. So investigators had a potentially significant clue. But the question remained. Was it evidence of planning, or evidence of a person desperately trying to understand frightening thoughts? January 24th began like an ordinary day. But by evening, prosecutors say the family was approaching a moment that had been deliberately set in motion. According to the Commonwealth's theory, Patrick Clancy was sent out of the house to run errands. The prosecution has argued that the trip gave Lindsay enough time and privacy to carry out the killings. One destination was a restaurant. Another was a CVS, where Patrick was obtaining medicine and other items. That detail became crucial, because prosecutors did not present the errands simply as background. They presented them as part of the plan. The defense sees the events through another lens. Its argument is that Lindsay was in a state of severe psychiatric deterioration, and that her actions cannot be understood as the calculated choices of a rational person. But there is no dispute over what happened next. Inside the family home, Lindsay Clancy strangled her 3 children. Court proceedings and prosecutors' evidence have described exercise resistance bands being used around the children's necks. The crime occurred in the basement. The children were left there. And then Lindsay Clancy attempted to take her own life. Authorities said she cut her wrists and neck before jumping from a second-story window. She survived. The fall left her paralyzed from the waist down. The children did not survive. At approximately 6:11 p.m., the first emergency call came in. The reported emergency was not initially described as a triple homicide. It was an apparent suicide attempt. A woman had jumped from a window. Responders arrived. Lindsay was found outside. She was injured and required immediate medical treatment. Then first responders entered the home, and the investigation changed completely. 3 children were discovered unconscious in the basement. Cora and Dawson were transported to Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Plymouth. They were pronounced dead. Callan was flown to Boston Children's Hospital. For several days, doctors fought to save him, but he too died. The medical examiner's office determined that Cora and Dawson died from asphyxia. Callan's cause of death was listed as complications of asphyxia. Patrick's 911 call from that evening became one of the most emotionally significant pieces of evidence in the case. Before trial, his attorney asked the court to restrict public access to the recording because of its traumatic nature. Judge William Sullivan ultimately ordered the 911 call and autopsy photographs to be impounded from public dissemination, while still allowing the prosecution and defense to use them as evidence in court. The decision illustrated something important. This was no longer simply a criminal investigation. It was now also a fight over how much of the family's private trauma would become public. The Duxbury Police Department contacted Massachusetts State Police detectives assigned to the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office. The investigation expanded rapidly. A search warrant was executed at the family home. Investigators collected electronic devices, cameras, a baby monitor, a journal, laptops, medications and physical evidence connected to the deaths. The home became a forensic scene. Investigators documented blood evidence. They collected samples from the basement. They examined the bedroom. They examined the window. They examined Lindsay Clancy herself. They collected swabs from beneath her fingernails and examined her clothing. And they examined the objects prosecutors say were used in the killings. Years later, during the 2026 trial, jurors would hear some of the forensic results. Massachusetts State Police forensic scientist Maureen Hartnett testified that stains found in multiple areas of the home tested as blood. That included stains on the basement floor, bedroom floor and windowsill. She also testified about a bloodstain in the snow outside the window where Lindsay had fallen. Some samples were submitted for DNA testing. The exercise bands were also examined, including their centers and handles, to determine whether DNA could identify people who had touched them. Then came a result that might sound surprising. A Massachusetts State Police trooper testified that investigators did not find usable fingerprints on the knife or exercise bands. That did not resolve the case. It simply meant fingerprint evidence could not provide a usable identification from those objects. For investigators, the case would therefore depend on a combination of physical evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony, medical evidence and, eventually, arguments about Lindsay's state of mind. As investigators reconstructed Lindsay's mental health history, another issue moved toward the center of the case: medication. The defense has argued that Lindsay was prescribed numerous psychiatric medications during the months leading up to the killings. The exact number has been described differently in public accounts depending on whether medications prescribed at different times or medications taken simultaneously are being counted. The defense has characterized the treatment as excessive and harmful. The prosecution has challenged that interpretation. During trial testimony, medical professionals discussed medications including benzodiazepines and antidepressants. On August 4, a state police forensic toxicologist testified that Lindsay's blood showed no illegal drugs and no alcohol. Benzodiazepines were detected. Those medications can be used for conditions including anxiety, insomnia and seizures. The testimony did not establish that illegal drugs caused the events. Nor did it, by itself, answer whether prescribed medications contributed to a psychiatric crisis. That question remains part of the broader battle between the two sides. And this is where the case becomes much more complicated than a conventional murder prosecution. Because the defense is not saying, "She didn't do it." It is essentially saying, "She did it, but her mind was so severely impaired that the law should not hold her criminally responsible." By the time the case reached trial, prosecutors and defense attorneys have constructed two radically different narratives from many of the same events. The prosecution's story is one of deliberate action. Prosecutors have argued that Lindsay sent Patrick out of the house deliberately. They say she had time to act. They say she researched ways to kill. They say she killed the children individually. And they argue that her suicide attempt afterward was part of a broader plan rather than proof that she was incapable of understanding her actions. Prosecutors have even questioned the sincerity of the suicide attempt. During trial testimony, medical professionals discussed injuries to Lindsay's neck and wrists that were described as superficial. The prosecution has suggested that this evidence may undermine the claim that she genuinely intended to die. The defense rejects that interpretation. And that distinction is essential. The prosecution is arguing for one interpretation of the physical evidence. The defense is asking jurors to see the same night through the lens of a severe psychiatric crisis. The defense says Lindsay had been deteriorating for months. It points to insomnia, depression, anxiety, psychiatric treatment, medication, hospitalization, and alleged psychotic symptoms. The defense has also said Lindsay experienced auditory hallucinations, including a voice that allegedly commanded her to kill the children. That allegation has appeared in civil litigation and in the defense's broader account of her mental state. It remains a defense claim, not an independently established fact. So the central mystery is not simply what happened. Investigators have reconstructed much of that. The mystery is, why? On July 27, 2026, Patrick Clancy entered the witness box. For a father who had lost all three of his children, the testimony was inevitably personal. He described Cora, Dawson, Callan. But prosecutors also wanted him to describe something else: the changes he had witnessed in his wife. Patrick testified that Lindsay's mental health had been deteriorating. He also described a disturbing conversation approximately a month before the killings in which she expressed thoughts about harming herself or the children. Yet he said he never witnessed her physically harm them. That contradiction became important because prosecutors wanted to show that Lindsay could function normally while concealing a dangerous plan. The defense wanted the same evidence interpreted differently. A woman who was struggling, frightened by her own thoughts, and attempting to continue caring for her children despite a deteriorating psychiatric condition. Patrick's position also made the case unusual. He has publicly expressed forgiveness toward Lindsay. But forgiveness is not the same thing as denying what happened. And his testimony demonstrated the emotional complexity of the case. A father could believe his children were murdered. He could believe their mother was responsible. And he could still believe that the woman who committed the crime was profoundly mentally ill. That tension would follow the jury throughout the trial. Then came another voice. Not Patrick's. Not the police. Not a prosecutor. Not a defense attorney. Lindsay's own writing. Her journal. During the 2026 trial, prosecutors presented diary entries from the months before the killings. The entries described Lindsay feeling overwhelmed, struggling with insomnia and anxiety, and desperately wanting relief from the pressures of caring for her family. The prosecution sees the writings as evidence of planning and conscious decision-making. The defense sees them as evidence of a woman documenting a worsening psychiatric condition and desperately trying to survive it. This is one of the strangest aspects of the case. The same document can tell two completely different stories depending on what question you ask. If the question is, was Lindsay suffering? The journal may appear to provide powerful evidence that she was. But if the question is, was she capable of making deliberate choices? The very act of writing down her thoughts could be interpreted differently. And that is precisely the conflict the jury must resolve. The defense's central argument involves postpartum psychosis. It is important not to confuse this with ordinary postpartum sadness or the much more common postpartum depression. Postpartum psychosis is rare and can involve a severe break from reality. According to medical experts cited by CBS and the Associated Press, it affects roughly 1 to 2 women per thousand after childbirth and is considered a psychiatric emergency. But the existence of postpartum psychosis is not really the central dispute. Even prosecutors acknowledge that serious psychiatric illness exists. The legal question is much narrower. Was Lindsay Clancy experiencing a mental disease or defect that made her legally not responsible for her actions when the children died? That is a question for the jury. And it requires more than simply proving that someone was depressed, anxious, medicated or mentally ill. It requires examining her actual mental state at the precise time of the killings. That is why the trial has focused so heavily on the months leading up to January 24. Her treatment, her behavior, her writing, her statements, her actions, and what she did immediately before and after the deaths. Crime scenes sometimes produce one unmistakable piece of evidence. This case has produced something more complicated. Blood evidence, medical evidence, electronic evidence, the exercise bands, the knife, medications, journals, clothing, DNA testing, and the physical evidence surrounding Lindsay's fall. The prosecution has attempted to construct a timeline from those pieces. On August 4, forensic testimony established that blood was found in multiple areas of the home and on evidence connected to Lindsay. Investigators also collected biological samples from the exercise bands and from Lindsay. But fingerprints on the bands and knife were not usable. And DNA testing was still being discussed as the trial proceeded. None of these findings, by themselves, answers the insanity question. A forensic scientist can tell a jury what was found. A medical expert can explain what an injury means. A psychiatrist can discuss symptoms. But ultimately, the jury has to connect those pieces and determine what they mean. The case formally moved toward prosecution in January 2023. Authorities initially announced homicide and strangulation charges involving the children. As the investigation developed, prosecutors sought an arrest warrant. A Plymouth County grand jury later indicted Lindsay Clancy on 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of strangulation. She pleaded not guilty. She remained in medical custody while receiving treatment. The case moved slowly through pretrial litigation. And eventually, the defense formally signaled that mental responsibility would be the central issue. The defense was not going to spend the trial arguing that the children were not killed by Lindsay. Instead, the courtroom would become a battle over her mind. Jury selection began in July 2026. It was not easy. Potential jurors were confronted with a case involving 3 young children, a surviving mother and a defense based on severe mental illness. Ultimately, 12 jurors and 6 alternates were selected. Opening statements began July 27. Prosecutors presented Lindsay as deliberate. The defense presented a woman whose psychiatric condition had deteriorated into psychosis after months of treatment. And then Patrick Clancy took the stand. The trial was expected to last weeks. Almost 200 potential witnesses were on the witness list, including police officers, medical professionals, firefighters and other witnesses. That alone demonstrates how much evidence exists in this case. This was never going to be resolved by one photograph, one statement or one medical record. The jury would have to absorb an enormous volume of information and then decide what mattered most. Before the jury even heard the evidence, Judge William Sullivan had to determine what the public would be allowed to see. The court restricted public dissemination of the children's autopsy photographs and Patrick's 911 call. The decision came after Patrick asked the court to protect his family from what he described as further emotional trauma caused by the widespread publication of graphic evidence. The judge also considered how many first responders should testify. The defense argued that repeatedly describing the crime scene risked becoming unnecessarily emotional and cumulative. The prosecution argued that each witness had a legitimate role because there were multiple victims and multiple aspects of the scene to explain. The judge ultimately declined to broadly restrict the testimony, saying he could intervene when descriptions became needlessly repetitive. It was another reminder that this trial isn't only about determining responsibility. It is also about how a courtroom processes tragedy. At the heart of the case is a deceptively simple word: control. Was Lindsay Clancy in control of her actions? The prosecution says yes. The defense says no. But neither side can simply tell the jury what to believe. They must prove their interpretation through evidence. Prosecutors have pointed to actions they say demonstrate planning. The errands. The timing. The alleged research. The individual killings. The sequence afterward. The defense points toward something else. The documented deterioration. The psychiatric treatment. The medications. The insomnia. The suicidal thoughts. The alleged hallucinations. The hospitalization. And the fact that Lindsay herself survived an apparent suicide attempt but was left permanently disabled. Each side is asking the jury to arrange the same pieces differently. The prosecution's puzzle creates a picture of deliberate action. The defense's puzzle creates a picture of psychiatric collapse. And somewhere between those two pictures lies the legal answer. In a case this emotionally charged, it is easy to turn allegations into facts. But responsible true crime storytelling requires restraint. The public record does not establish that every allegation made by prosecutors is true. The search warrant allegation that Lindsay researched ways to kill is not the same as publishing the complete search history. The defense's claim that she heard a commanding voice is not the same as an independent recording of that voice. The disagreement over her medications does not automatically prove medical malpractice. And the fact that she suffered from mental illness does not automatically establish legal insanity. Likewise, the prosecution's claim that she planned the killings does not become fact simply because prosecutors say it. Those questions belong to the evidence and ultimately to the jury. That distinction is particularly important here because the legal system is not asking the public to decide whether Lindsay Clancy was a good mother. It is asking a much narrower question. Was she criminally responsible for what happened? On August 4, 2026, the trial entered its sixth day of testimony. Forensic evidence was still being presented. A state police toxicologist testified about Lindsay's blood. No illegal drugs or alcohol were detected. Benzodiazepines were present. Another trooper testified about fingerprint examination. No usable fingerprints were recovered from the knife or exercise bands. Forensic scientist Maureen Hartnett testified about blood evidence from the home and the samples collected for further analysis. And the jury was still hearing evidence. There was still no verdict. That means any documentary claiming today that Lindsay Clancy has been convicted or acquitted would be manufacturing an ending that does not exist. The story is still unfolding. And this is where the story must stop. Not because the evidence has disappeared. Not because the questions have been answered. But because, as of August 4, 2026, the jury has not delivered its final decision. Lindsay Clancy remains charged with 3 murders. The defense has not disputed that she killed her children. Its argument is that she was not criminally responsible because of severe psychiatric illness. The prosecution argues that she deliberately killed them and should be held accountable. Those competing narratives remain unresolved. If the jury finds her guilty of murder, she could face a life sentence without parole. If the jury finds her not criminally responsible by reason of insanity, that would not mean she simply walks out of the courthouse. Under Massachusetts law, such a finding can result in confinement in a state psychiatric facility, with later judicial reviews concerning whether the person remains a danger to themselves or others. But none of that has happened yet. The jury has not reached that point. The trial is still being heard. And the most important legal question remains unanswered. There is another aftermath beyond the courtroom. Cora, Dawson, Callan. Their names are no longer simply the names of 3 children in a family. They have become evidence in a criminal proceeding. Their photographs have become exhibits. Their final moments have become the subject of forensic reconstruction. Their father has had to describe them publicly. And their deaths have become part of a national conversation about postpartum mental illness and the limits, and failures, of mental health care. Lindsay and Patrick Clancy have each filed civil lawsuits involving healthcare providers, alleging failures in the treatment of Lindsay's mental health before the killings. Those civil allegations are separate from the criminal case and remain allegations rather than established findings. The case has also raised questions about how severe postpartum psychiatric symptoms are recognized. How do doctors distinguish depression from something more dangerous? How should families respond when someone says they are having frightening thoughts? What happens when treatment doesn't appear to be working? And what happens when the person asking for help is still capable of appearing perfectly functional? These are difficult questions. But they are important questions. Because discussing mental illness after a tragedy is not the same as excusing a crime. It is possible to recognize the reality of psychiatric illness while still recognizing the irreversible harm done to victims. A quiet home in Duxbury became a crime scene. A mother became a defendant. A father became a witness. And 3 children became the center of a legal battle over one of the most difficult questions imaginable. Can someone commit an unspeakable act and, at the same time, be so mentally ill that the law should not hold them criminally responsible? The answer cannot be determined by a headline. It cannot be determined by a photograph. It cannot be determined by whether Lindsay Clancy looks calm in a courtroom. And it cannot be determined by whether the public finds her actions understandable. It must come from evidence. Medical evidence.